I knew the gala was in trouble before Cassie and Rook ever touched the microphone, because my job had taught me that public disasters almost never began loudly. They began in the small things people ignored. A board member leaning too close to another board member's ear. A waiter pausing near the wrong table because he could feel tension without knowing its name. A security guard checking the same entrance twice. And a wealthy man smiling at my boss like the room belonged to him simply because he had once helped pay for it. I stood near the side exit of the Grand Aurelia ballroom with an earpiece in, a tablet in my left hand, and a full layout of the building in my head. Officially, I was the Senior Operations Coordinator for Hawthorne Protective Events, which meant I handled movement, staff timing, access points, emergency routes, guest control, and all the problems powerful people expected to disappear before they became visible. Unofficially, I was the man who noticed what everyone else preferred to call atmosphere. Seren Hawthorne stood on stage beneath 3 chandeliers and 200 expensive faces, giving the closing remarks for the company's biggest charity security gala of the year. To the room, she looked untouchable. Her silver dress caught the light just enough to make every camera love her. Her voice stayed calm enough to settle investors, and her smile had the exact controlled warmth that made clients believe their secrets, jewelry, families, and reputations were safe with her company. But I had worked under Seren long enough to know the difference between confidence and armor. She was not relaxed. Her right hand rested against the podium too still. Her shoulders were straight in a way that did not belong to comfort. Every time Cassian moved near the front table, her gaze avoided him by a fraction too carefully. That was the thing about Seren Hawthorne. She could command a room full of men twice her age, but she had never learned how to look weak without feeling like she was handing someone a weapon. Cassian Rook waited until the applause from her speech began to fade before he stood with his champagne glass raised. He did not interrupt like a crude man. He rose like the room had invited him, like his timing was a gift, like the story of the night had always been waiting for his voice. I saw Seren's fingers tighten around the edge of the podium, and I stepped half a pace away from the wall before I even decided to move. Cassian began with praise, which was how men like him sharpened the knife without making the blade visible. He spoke about Seren's vision, her ambition, her brilliance, and the difficult road they had once walked together. People smiled because they thought they were hearing a graceful ex-fiancé honoring a powerful woman. Then his voice softened, and he said success could make a person forget who had stood beside her before the world applauded. A few guests laughed awkwardly. Cassian kept smiling, and added that he hoped Seren would one day understand that ending their engagement had been an emotional decision, not a permanent one, and that he still believed in the woman he had helped shape. The room did not gasp. Rich rooms rarely gave you that kind of honesty. Instead, the air changed. Phones lifted. Board members looked at each other without moving their heads too much. Marin Shaw, Seren's assistant, went pale near the service entrance. Seren stayed perfectly still, and that was what made my jaw lock. If she had stormed off, the room would have called her unstable. If she had challenged him, he would have looked wounded and patient. So she stood there and accepted a public humiliation dressed up as devotion, because powerful women were expected to bleed without staining the carpet. When the scattered applause came, Cassian lowered his glass like he had just forgiven her in front of everyone. Seren thanked him with a voice so smooth that only someone watching closely would know how much it cost. Then she stepped down from the stage and walked toward the private hallway behind the ballroom. Cassian followed her, and I followed him. I kept enough distance to avoid turning the hallway into a scene, but close enough that Cassian would know he was no longer alone with her. The corridor behind the ballroom was narrow, lined with service doors, storage rooms, and framed hotel art nobody looked at unless they were trying to avoid someone's eyes. Seren was halfway to the staff elevator when Cassian caught up. He did not grab her. Men like him understood witnesses. He only stepped close enough to make her path feel smaller, then lowered his voice and told her she had made the night more embarrassing than it needed to be. Seren said he had done that himself. Cassian smiled as if she had disappointed him. He told her the board was watching, investors were watching, and if she kept making emotional choices, people would begin asking whether she could separate leadership from personal instability. I saw her chin lift by 1 inch. I also saw her left hand curl at her side. That was enough. I stepped fully into the hallway and let my presence interrupt the angle he had created. Cassian turned toward me slowly, his expression still polite, but his eyes already cold. He said my name like I was a staff badge, not a man. I did not answer him first. I looked at Seren, because the point was not to take over her fight. The point was to make sure she still had an exit. Her eyes met mine, controlled and furious and tired in a way she would never allow the ballroom to see. Cassian said this was a private conversation. I looked at the space between his body and the elevator door, then back at him, and told him it was a blocked exit. I did not raise my voice, and I did not step close enough to make it look like a threat. I only shifted my shoulders enough to make the hallway open for Seren and close for him. Cassian noticed. Men who lived by control always noticed when control moved. Seren walked past him without touching either of us. When she reached my side, she did not thank me, because thanking me would have admitted she needed help and she was not ready to give anyone in that hallway another piece of her. Near the service elevator, she said she did not want the company driver. I looked at her, already understanding the risk. Half the ballroom had watched Cassian humiliate her. Some of them had seen me enter the hallway after him. If I drove her home, people could turn a professional decision into a scandal by morning. Seren knew that too. She still looked at me and said, "Drive me home, Dorian." I should have called Marin, documented the incident, assigned another security driver, and stayed out of the story. Instead, I nodded and said yes. When I added ma'am, her face tightened, not with anger exactly, but with exhaustion. She said, "Not tonight." So I corrected myself and said, "Seren." We took the service elevator down in silence. The mirrored doors showed her reflection beside mine. Polished silver dress next to my black suit, CEO next to employee, a woman everyone called untouchable standing beside the man whose job was to remain useful and invisible. I kept my eyes forward, but in the reflection I saw the first real crack in her composure. Her lips pressed together, her lashes lowered. One breath came in too carefully, as if she was forcing it through a door that had almost closed. By the time I brought the car around to the lower exit, the night air had turned cold and the hotel lights were spilling gold across the wet pavement. Seren got into the passenger seat without waiting for me to open the door. That was her way. Accept help, but never enough to let anyone feel powerful for giving it. I pulled away from the hotel and gave her the first minute of silence because I knew she needed it more than comfort. Her phone lit up in her lap before we reached the main avenue. Cassian's name flashed once, disappeared, then flashed again. She turned the screen face down, but the light kept pulsing against her fingers like an order. I checked the rearview mirror out of habit, then checked it again because instinct had already found what logic was still testing. A black SUV rolled out from the hotel driveway 2 cars behind us. Clean paint, dark windows, slow enough to pretend coincidence, close enough to be a message. I changed lanes once. The SUV changed lanes behind me. I passed the turn toward Seren's penthouse and took a narrower street used mostly by delivery trucks and late-night hotel staff. The SUV followed. Seren noticed my eyes in the mirror and said my name in a low warning, as if she already knew what I had seen and hated that it was real. I told her Cassian was behind us. Her face did not break, but her hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles showed pale. She told me not to make a scene because that was what he wanted. I said I had no intention of giving him one, but I was not taking him to her building either. The light ahead turned red, and I eased the car to a stop at the intersection. Cassian's SUV pulled in behind us, too close for traffic and too deliberate for accident. Seren's phone lit up again, his name flashing in the dark between us. And for the first time all night, the woman who commanded boardrooms, donors, staff, and clients looked like she was tired of being strong alone. She did not ask me to save her. She did not cry. She did not give me some helpless confession that would make this simple. She only reached across the console and took my hand at the red light, her fingers cold against mine, and in that one quiet movement I understood exactly how much trust she had just placed in me. I covered her hand with mine, steady but not possessive, and kept my eyes on the mirror while Cassian's headlights burned behind us. "He doesn't get to decide where you go tonight," I said, and when the light turned green, I did not drive toward her home. I did not turn toward Seren's penthouse, and she knew it before the city signs confirmed it. Her hand was still under mine, cold at first, then slowly warming as if her body had needed proof that I was not going to shake her off and call it professionalism. Behind us, Cassian's SUV kept close enough to make sure we saw him, but not close enough to look reckless on traffic cameras. That was his style. Pressure without fingerprints. Threat without evidence. He had humiliated her in a ballroom full of witnesses and still left enough softness in his voice for people to call it heartbreak. Now he was following her through downtown like concern gave him the right to choose her destination. I kept one hand on the wheel and one over Seren's, not gripping, not claiming, just steady enough that she could pull away whenever she wanted. She did not. The light changed, and I moved with it, turning left instead of straight, then cutting through the financial district where the roads narrowed and the office towers threw long black reflections across the wet pavement. Seren finally looked at me, not with fear, but with the controlled anger of a woman who hated needing anyone to witness what she had survived. She told me Cassian would use this if I made it obvious. He would say she was unstable, that I overstepped, that she had turned a personal breakup into a security incident because she could not handle public pressure. I told her I knew. That was why I was not speeding, not swerving, not giving him a chase he could package into a story by morning. I changed lanes only when I had a reason. I watched storefront windows for reflections when the mirrors were blocked. I took streets I knew from event load-ins, service routes, hotel exits, and late-night vendor access points. My job was movement, and tonight movement meant making sure Cassian could not predict where she would be vulnerable next. Seren's phone lit up again. This time the call came with a message preview that filled the screen before she could turn it over. "Pick up before this gets worse." Her fingers twitched under mine. I felt the reaction more than saw it, a small tightening that told me the sentence had landed exactly where he wanted it to. I asked if she wanted me to block the number for the night. She almost laughed, but it came out without humor. She said blocking Cassian never blocked the problem. He would call Marin, then Elowen, then 3 board members who still thought his money was the reason her company had survived its first year. He would make his concern travel faster than her truth. I kept my eyes on the road and said, "Then we make sure the truth has timestamps." She turned slightly toward me. I told her every street we had taken had traffic cameras. The hotel garage had exit records, and if he kept following, the route would show who pursued whom. For the first time since she reached for my hand, her breathing changed from panic control to calculation. That was Seren returning to herself, not because I had saved her, but because I had given her a clean fact she could stand on. The SUV stayed with us for another 6 blocks. Cassian was either too arrogant to realize I was documenting him through route choice, or too angry to care. I guided us away from the open avenue and toward the industrial edge of downtown, where Hawthorne Protective Events kept overflow equipment in a secured garage beneath an old converted warehouse. It was not a place clients knew about. It was where we stored temporary barricades, backup radios, stanchions, portable lighting, and the ugly practical pieces that made elegant events function. Seren noticed the turn and stiffened. She asked where I was taking her. I told her not home, and not anywhere Cassian had leverage. Her eyes narrowed because, even scared, Seren did not like being moved without explanation. I respected that. I told her the garage had cameras, controlled access, 2 exits, and staff credentials tied to entry logs. If Cassian followed us in, he would stop being a concerned ex-fiancé and become a man who had trailed the CEO of a security firm into a restricted property after midnight. She stared at me for a second, and something in her expression shifted. Not softness, exactly. Recognition. Maybe she was finally seeing the part of me most people missed, because I did not advertise it. I was not a driver. I was not just the man who arranged vendor doors and kept gala schedules from collapsing. Before operations, before suits and tablets and board-friendly language, I had worked field security long enough to understand that strength was not noise. Strength was choosing the place, the angle, the witness, the exit, and the exact moment not to blink. Seren withdrew her hand then, slowly, and I felt the loss of it more than I should have. She did not pull away because she regretted touching me. She pulled away because she needed both hands to become herself again. She lifted her chin, looked into the side mirror, and said, "If he follows us in, I want the footage preserved." There she was. I almost smiled, already set to cloud back up. The secured garage entrance appeared ahead, half hidden between a loading dock and a row of darkened warehouse windows. I tapped my access card against the console reader clipped to my visor, then entered the code on the keypad. The gate rolled up with a metallic groan. I drove in slowly, giving Cassian every opportunity to keep going if he had enough sense left to protect his own image. For 3 seconds, I thought maybe he would. Then his headlights turned in behind us, bright and arrogant against the concrete walls. Seren exhaled once through her nose, not fear this time, but disbelief hardened into anger. The gate began closing behind him, and by the time he realized he had followed us into a recorded, restricted space, the decision was already logged. I parked near the central pillar where the cameras covered both vehicle doors. Before I could speak, Seren said she was not staying in the car like cargo. I looked at her, and even under everything happening, I respected the hell out of that. I told her I was not asking her to hide. I was asking her to let me step out first because Cassian was not angry at the truth yet. He was angry at losing control, and men like that often mistook the nearest door for a right. She held my gaze, then nodded once. I removed my suit jacket and set it on the back of the seat, not for drama, but because tight fabric slowed the shoulders. I rolled my sleeves once, checked the mirror, and opened the door. Cassian stepped out of the SUV with his phone already in his hand, as if arriving with a device made him the reasonable one. His smile was gone now, replaced by something flatter and uglier. He looked at me first, then past me towards Seren, who had opened her own door and stood beside the car with one hand resting on the frame. His eyes flickered with irritation when he realized she was not cowering. He said this had gone far enough and told Seren to get in his car so they could discuss the damage before it became permanent. I stepped half a pace sideways, not in front of Seren's voice, but between Cassian and the line he clearly wanted to cross. He laughed once and called me staff, like the word itself should move me out of his way. I told him he was in a restricted garage after following the CEO from a private event against her wishes, and every second he stayed made the footage better for her lawyers. That wiped the last of the polish from his face. He moved towards Seren's door anyway, fast enough to test me, but not fast enough to look like an attack if he had to explain it later. I met him at the front corner of my car and put one hand against the door frame, blocking the path without touching him. He told me to move. I told him no. He leaned closer and said I had no idea whose life I was interfering with. Seren's voice cut through before mine could. She said, "Mine. Cassian, you're interfering with mine." He looked at her then, and for 1 second I saw the real injury in him. Not heartbreak, but insult. She was supposed to be embarrassed, cornered, grateful for a private exit back into his version of the world. Instead, she was standing beside my car in a secured garage, watching him lose the one thing he had mistaken for love: control. Cassian tried to shove past my arm. I redirected him hard into the concrete pillar with enough force to stop him, not enough to injure him, and kept my forearm across the space between his chest and Seren's door. The sound was sharp in the garage, but I did not raise my voice. I told him he could call his attorney, call the board, call every investor who still confused his money with ownership, but he would not touch her door tonight. For the first time, Cassian looked at me like I was not furniture. Seren looked at me too, and what passed through her eyes was not fear of my strength. It was the recognition that I had used it without making her smaller. Cassian straightened his coat, breathing harder now, humiliation crawling up his neck. He said by morning everyone would know she left the gala with me, that she had let an employee put hands on her former fiancé, that the board would have questions about judgment, leadership, and whatever inappropriate loyalty I thought I had earned. Seren's face stayed calm, but I saw the threat land. Cassian smiled again because he saw it too. Then he turned back to his SUV and left us with the sound of tires against concrete and a scandal already forming in the air. Only when the gate closed behind him did Seren let her hand fall from the car door. The garage became quiet around us, cameras blinking red above, my pulse still controlled but heavy in my chest. She looked at the space where Cassian had stood, then at me. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. I picked up my jacket from the driver's seat and answered honestly. "He shouldn't have followed you." I did not take Seren to her penthouse after Cassian left the garage, and this time she did not question the turn. Maybe she understood the practical reason before I explained it. Cassian knew where she lived, knew the building staff, knew which private elevator opened near her floor, and probably knew exactly how to stand in her lobby looking wounded enough for people to call him concerned. But there was another reason I did not say out loud right away. Her penthouse belonged to the version of Seren everyone knew how to reach. Investors could call her there. Board members could pressure her there. Cassian could send flowers, apologies, threats disguised as concern, and every kind of polished reminder that the life she had built still had doors he believed he could knock on. I did not want to take her back to another room where she would be expected to look untouchable before she had even been allowed to breathe. The drive from the secured garage to my apartment was quiet in a different way than the first one. Before, silence had been danger moving behind us. Now it was consequence sitting between us, heavier and harder to name. Seren kept her hands folded in her lap, no longer trembling, but too still. The city lights moved across her face as we passed closed storefronts, late-night diners, and rain-dark streets almost empty except for delivery vans and taxis. She looked straight ahead for several minutes before saying Cassian would not stop at the garage footage. He would call Elowen Price before breakfast. He would tell the board he was worried about Seren's judgment, that she had allowed an employee to escalate a private matter, that I had assaulted him, that she had left a public event in a compromised emotional state. She said all of it calmly, like she was reciting weather conditions. I told her he could try, but the cameras would show him following us, entering restricted property, moving toward her door, and ignoring a clear boundary. Seren's mouth tightened. She said men like Cassian did not need the truth to win immediately. They only needed enough doubt to make everyone ask why a woman had needed protecting in the first place. I pulled into the lot behind my building, an old converted warehouse that still looked like it expected forklifts instead of tenants. My apartment was on the second floor above a row of empty commercial units that had once been a print shop, then a storage space, then nothing useful at all. It was not impressive. And after the chandeliers, marble, and private elevators of Seren's world, I felt the plainness of it more sharply than usual. The brick stairwell smelled faintly of dust, laundry soap, and old rain. One light flickered near the landing. Seren followed me without comment, heels in one hand now, because at some point between the garage and my building, she had decided pain was no longer required for dignity. That small decision made me respect her more than any speech she had given that night. Inside, my apartment looked exactly like what it was, a disciplined life arranged for function, not comfort. The kitchen counter was clear. The boots near the door were lined up. A black duffel sat under the entry bench. There was a heavy bag hanging near the far window, a row of old security manuals on a shelf, 2 framed photos turned face down beside the television, and almost nothing that suggested I expected anyone else to stay long. Seren noticed all of it because, of course she did. She stood near the doorway in her silver dress, the glamour of the gala looking almost wounded under my cheap ceiling light, and said my place looked like a man who could leave in 10 minutes if he had to. I locked the door, set my keys down, and told her 15 if I packed badly. She did not smile. She looked at the turned-down photographs instead and asked if I always lived like disappearing was a reasonable option. I gave her water first because answering that question honestly required more courage than I had gathered. Then I found a clean black t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants from the laundry basket I had actually folded 2 days earlier, which felt like the only responsible thing I had done all week. I handed them to her and pointed toward the bathroom. She took the clothes, but before she went in, she looked at me and said, "I am not fragile, Dorian." I told her I knew. She said taking her somewhere safe did not mean I got to wrap the rest of the night in silence. I told her I knew that too, but I also knew the difference between giving someone space and making them beg for it. That was the first time her expression softened without her permission. She disappeared into the bathroom, and I stood in my own kitchen feeling like the air had changed shape. When she came back wearing my shirt and sweatpants folded twice at the waist, the room became more dangerous than the garage had been. Not because she looked seductive in some obvious way, but because she looked real. The CEO armor was gone. The silver dress was folded over one arm. Her hair had loosened around her face, and the red mark from one earring showed near her neck. She placed the dress carefully over the back of a chair, then walked to the heavy bag by the window and touched the worn leather with 2 fingers. She asked if I boxed. I told her I trained when thinking became too loud. She looked back at me and said that sounded like a controlled way to admit I hit things. I said only things built for it. She held my gaze for a moment, and I knew she was thinking about Cassian against the concrete pillar, about my forearm blocking her car door, about the exact amount of force I had used and the amount I had chosen not to. I told her I had worked field security before operations, mostly executive movement and high-risk event transfers, the kind of job where nobody remembered you unless something went wrong. Talon Greer and I had handled clients who smiled on magazine covers while their private lives required 3 exit routes and a man at every door. I learned fast that being useful made people comfortable, but being visible made them nervous. Powerful men liked me when I kept threats away from them. They liked me less when I noticed they were the threat. Seren listened without interrupting, sitting now on the edge of my couch with the water glass between both hands. She said that explained why I always stood where I could see the room and never where people could see me. I almost denied it, but she had already caught the shape of me too cleanly. So I told her invisibility had worked for a long time. She asked if it still did. I looked at her in my clothes, in my apartment, after I had put myself between her and the man who wanted to turn her life into a boardroom vote, and said no. That answer seemed to give her permission to tell the truth she had been holding all night. Cassian had helped fund the company in its earliest year, when banks smiled politely and declined, when older investors treated Seren like a beautiful front office for an imaginary man's strategy. At first, Cassian had called his money belief. Then, slowly, belief became leverage. He corrected her in private and praised her in public. He introduced her as brilliant but intense, ambitious but emotional, exceptional but difficult. Every compliment came with a small handle attached, something he could use later to steer the room. When she ended the engagement, he did not plead. He reorganized. He called investors. He met board members for lunch. He made concerned sound responsible. By the time she realized he was not trying to win her back but pull her company closer to him, half the people around her were already asking whether she was under too much stress. I sat across from her, elbows on my knees, hands clasped because reaching for her would have been too easy and not yet fair. I told her none of that made tonight her fault. Seren laughed once, small and tired, and said fault was not the problem. Power was. Cassian still had enough of it to make people hesitate before believing her. Then she looked down at the water glass and said something quieter, something that changed the room more than any confession of fear could have. She said she reached for my hand at the red light because she knew I would not use that moment against her. Not later, not in anger, not to make myself important. She said, "I knew you would understand it was trust, not surrender. I had spent years being useful to people who forgot me once the danger passed, but no one had ever described my restraint like it had meant something. I wanted to tell her that her hand in mine had felt like being chosen in the middle of a storm. Instead, I said the only thing I could trust myself to say without crossing the line too fast. You were right." Seren's eyes lifted to mine, and the silence after that was not empty. It was full of every rule that said she was my boss, every threat Cassian had left behind, every board member waiting to turn one private night into evidence, and every part of me that no longer wanted to be invisible if being visible meant standing beside her. Outside, rain began again against the warehouse windows. Seren looked toward the sound, then back at me, and for the first time all night, she did not look untouchable or broken. She looked like a woman deciding whether the safest place in the room might also be the most dangerous one for her heart. The rain kept working against the warehouse windows while Seren sat on my couch in my black t-shirt and folded sweatpants, looking too powerful to be fragile and too exhausted to keep pretending power did not cost anything. I made coffee because neither of us was going to sleep soon, but I set the mug on the table instead of putting it directly into her hands. Small things mattered with a woman who had spent years being handled by people who called it concern. She noticed the distance and the choice behind it. I saw that in the way her eyes moved from the mug to my face, and for a second the room held the kind of quiet that made every ordinary movement feel personal. I wanted to tell her she could stay as long as she needed. I wanted to tell her Cassian would not get near her again tonight. I wanted to say a dozen things that sounded protective and dangerous because each one placed me closer to a line I had no right to cross while she was still wearing the aftermath of another man's control. So I said the practical thing first. I told her the garage footage would be preserved. The entry logs would show Cassian followed us into restricted property, and if he tried to twist the story by morning, we would have more than memory to answer him with. Seren looked almost disappointed, then almost grateful, and I understood both reactions because I had made myself useful again when the room had been asking for honesty. She took the coffee, held it between both hands, and said my name in the tone people used when they were tired of watching me hide inside competence. I leaned back against the kitchen counter and waited. She asked if I was always this careful because of the job, or if the job had simply given me a respectable excuse to be that way. It was a sharper question than I expected, but not unfair. I told her careful men lasted longer in rooms where powerful people needed someone to blame. She said that was not an answer. I looked at the two turned-down photos beside the television and knew she had already seen more than I wanted her to. One photo was Talon and me outside a private airfield after a security transfer that had gone wrong, but not publicly. The other was my father in a Navy work shirt, standing beside an old pickup, one hand on my shoulder when I was still young enough to believe strong men never needed help. I had turned them down months ago during a cleaning day and never turned them back up, maybe because both reminded me of the same thing. Men could be useful their whole lives and still come home to rooms that did not know what to do with them. I told Seren my father had been the kind of man everyone called when something broke, but no one called when nothing was needed. He fixed engines, patched roofs, picked people up from bad situations, and taught me early that a man's value was measured by how quickly he could become necessary and how little trouble he caused afterward. That kind of lesson looked noble from the outside, but it had a cost. I learned how to stand in the background and make things safe. I learned how to stay calm so other people could fall apart. I learned how to leave before anyone had to decide whether I belonged after the danger passed. Seren listened without softening the story for me. That was one of the things that made her difficult to look away from. She did not rush in with comfort just to make herself feel kind. She let the truth sit there until I had to own it. Then she said Cassian had built his power from the opposite direction. He made himself impossible to remove from a room, then called that devotion. He confused being needed with being owed. He had looked at her company, her body, her future, and somehow decided all of it was a debt he had the right to collect. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table before I could answer. Both of us looked down. It was not Cassian this time. It was Maren. Seren picked it up, read the message, and the small amount of peace that had entered her face disappeared. Maren had sent a screenshot from an internal board thread. Cassian had already begun. The message was polished, of course. He wrote that he was concerned about Seren's emotional state after the gala, concerned about an employee's aggressive interference, concerned about optics, concerned about whether leadership stability could be questioned by major clients. Concern appeared 4 times in 6 lines, and every time it meant control. Seren read it once, then again, and I saw the CEO return before the woman had finished bleeding. Her spine straightened. Her face cooled. She handed me the phone, not because she needed me to fix it, but because she wanted me to see the battlefield forming. I read the thread, then set the phone down carefully because anger made men sloppy if they let it drive. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and pulled the security dashboard from the garage. Seren stood behind my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her but not touching me. The footage loaded in clean angles. My car entering first, Cassian's SUV following after the gate was already rising. Both vehicles logged by timestamp, Cassian stepping out with his phone, moving towards Seren's door, me blocking the path, him trying to shove past, my arm redirecting him into the pillar, and his final threat before leaving. It was not perfect for public opinion because truth never looked as clean as lies want it to sound, but it was enough to prove sequence, pursuit, restricted entry, and escalation. I downloaded the clips, backed them up, and sent copies to the secure evidence folder with restricted access. Seren watched without speaking until I finished. Then she said Cassian would still make it about me touching him. I said he could, but then he would have to explain why he ignored the CEO of a security company telling him to stop. She looked at me then with something almost fierce in her eyes. "You heard that?" she asked. I told her I heard everything that mattered. That answer changed the room more than I intended. Seren rested one hand on the back of the chair, and for the first time since the red light, I saw the emotional part of her reach forward before the controlled part could pull it back. She said everyone heard Cassian when he sounded reasonable. Everyone heard the board when they sounded cautious. Everyone heard investors when they sounded nervous. But almost no one heard her when she said no quietly, because quiet refusal from a woman like her was treated like the opening move in a negotiation. I turned in the chair to face her, careful to keep my hands visible and still, because the last thing I wanted was to turn her pain into my moment. I told her I heard her in the hallway, in the garage, and in the car. I heard her when she told me not to make a scene, when she reached for my hand instead of asking to be rescued, and when she stood beside the door instead of hiding behind it. Seren's eyes shone, but she did not cry. I admired her for that, and I hated that she had been trained to treat tears like evidence. The night stretched thin after that. I told her she could take the bedroom and I would sleep on the couch. She told me not to insult her intelligence by pretending I was going to sleep at all. She was right. I gave her the bedroom anyway, because the door had a lock and because choice mattered more than convenience. Before she went in, she paused in the hallway with one hand on the frame, still wearing my clothes, still holding herself like a woman who could command an army if the army did not ask whether she was okay first. She said she did not know what the board would do tomorrow. I told her whatever they did, Cassian would not be the only one in the room with proof. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "That is not what scares me most." I knew better than to ask quickly. She continued on her own. "What scares me is that when I reached for your hand, I didn't feel weak. I felt honest." Then she stepped into the bedroom and closed the door softly, leaving me in the hallway with the kind of truth that made sleep impossible. By morning, Cassian had done exactly what Seren said he would do, which made the entire company feel less like an office and more like a room where someone had opened a gas line and politely asked everyone not to smell smoke. I arrived at Hawthorne Protective Events just before 8, wearing the same calm face I used when a client lost a diamond bracelet or a drunk senator tried to exit through a service corridor. But the lobby told me the damage had already started. Conversation stopped half a second too late. 2 junior coordinators glanced at me, then looked down at their tablets with the guilty speed of people who had already watched a clip they were pretending not to understand. Someone had cut Cassian's toast from the gala into a short internal video, trimmed perfectly to show his wounded dignity and Seren's frozen smile, then paired it with a blurry shot of me walking after them into the private hallway. There was no clip of him following her SUV through the city. No clip of the restricted garage. No clip of Seren saying no. Just enough truth to make a lie look balanced. Marin Shaw found me near the operations bullpen before I reached my desk. She had 2 phones in one hand, a headset around her neck, and the expression of a woman who had already handled 6 emergencies before coffee. She did not waste time asking if the rumors were true. Marin never wasted time on questions that helped no one. She only said Elwyn Price had called a closed-door board meeting at 9. Cassian's attorney had requested to attend remotely, and Seren had been in her office for 20 minutes, looking like she could either win a war or walk through a window without breaking stride. Then Marin lowered her voice and told me people were already using my name. Not loudly, not officially. That was how corporate damage began. First, people said the employee instead of Dorian. Then, judgment concerns. Then, possible misconduct. By lunch, if Cassian had his way, I would not be the man who prevented him from forcing Seren into his car. I would be the subordinate whose inappropriate loyalty proved Seren had lost control of her boundaries. I asked where Seren was, and Marin pointed toward the executive corridor before adding, "She told me not to let you near the boardroom." That should have surprised me, but it did not. Seren's first instinct was still to contain the blast radius around herself. She would let Cassian attack her leadership before she let him use me as a weapon against my own career. It was noble in the way self-sacrifice often looked noble right before it became unnecessary damage. I went to her office anyway. The door was open, but the room felt closed around her. Seren stood behind her desk in a white suit, hair pinned back, makeup precise, every visible inch of her restored to command. Only the coffee untouched near her elbow and the faint shadows under her eyes admitted that she had spent part of the night in my apartment wearing my clothes and telling me the truth in a voice softer than any board member deserved to hear. She looked up when I entered, and for one moment neither of us spoke. The office glass behind her showed the city in daylight, all hard edges and reflective towers, a world that rewarded people who looked polished enough to be believed. Seren said I should not be there. I said that depended on whether she meant her office or the company. Her mouth tightened because she knew I was not going to make this easy. She told me Cassian was trying to frame last night as emotional instability and employee escalation. If I stayed near her during the board meeting, it would help his story. I told her if I disappeared, it would help his story more. Men like Cassian counted on silence from the people who had the facts, because silence looked professional until someone else filled it with accusation. Seren came around the desk, stopping close enough that I could see how hard she was holding herself together. She said, "I am trying to protect your job," I answered, "and I am trying to protect the truth." That made her angry, but not because I was wrong. She turned away from me, one hand pressing briefly against the back of her chair, and said truth did not always arrive in a room with enough power to matter. The board cared about investor confidence, client perception, leadership stability, legal exposure, and whether Cassian's remaining financial influence could become a problem during renewal season. They would care about the facts only after they decided which facts cost less. I told her that was why facts needed structure. We had timestamps, access logs, camera footage, call records, and the route from the hotel to the restricted garage. Cassian had an edited clip and a public performance. Seren looked back at me then, and I saw the fight in her begin to reorganize. She had spent years winning rooms by being sharper than the men who underestimated her. She did not need me to save her from the board. She needed one person in the building willing to stand inside the truth without asking whether it looked convenient. At 9, Elowen Price gathered the board in the upper conference room, where the chairs were expensive enough to make bad decisions look refined. Seren entered first. I entered behind Marin with a secured tablet and the incident packet, because I was still senior operations and the garage was still company property, no matter how badly Cassian wanted to turn me into gossip. Elowen's face remained unreadable when she saw me, but 2 board members shifted in their seats. Cassian appeared on the wall screen through his attorney's conference link, sitting in some private office with bruised pride hidden under perfect lighting. He looked less like a man who had followed a woman into a restricted garage after midnight, and more like a concerned former investor forced to address instability for the good of the company. It was impressive, and the way a locked door is impressive when you know someone built it to keep you inside. Cassian's attorney began with concern. Concern for Seren's well-being. Concern for the company's image. Concern over reports that an employee had physically engaged with Mr. Rook during what should have remained a private, personal matter. Seren listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her expression calm enough to make weaker men mistake her for cornered. When the attorney implied Seren had left the gala in an emotionally compromised state and allowed me to intervene beyond my role, I felt every eye in the room move toward me. I did not react. Reacting would have served Cassian. I waited until Elowen asked whether operations had documentation of the incident. Then I placed the tablet on the conference table and connected it to the screen. The first clip showed my car leaving the hotel's lower exit with Cassian's SUV pulling out behind us. The second showed 2 route changes and his SUV maintaining position. The third showed the restricted garage access log, my credential entry, Cassian's unauthorized vehicle entering behind us, the gate closing, his movement toward Seren's passenger door, my block, his attempt to force past, and the controlled redirection into the pillar. There was no dramatic music, no emotional speech, just sequence. That was the beauty of operational truth. It did not need to sound wounded to be clear. I paused the footage at the frame where Seren stood beside the car door, fully visible, not hiding, not collapsing, not confused. Then I said Cassian had followed the CEO from a company event, entered restricted company property without authorization, approached her vehicle after she had refused contact, and was stopped with minimum necessary force after attempting to bypass a physical boundary. Cassian's face changed by a fraction on the screen. Not enough for a casual viewer, enough for me. His attorney tried to redirect, suggesting my personal loyalty to Seren might have colored my interpretation. Before I could answer, Seren spoke. Her voice did not rise, but the room adjusted around it. She said her leadership was not unstable because she refused private pressure from a former fiancé. Her judgment was not compromised because she accepted transportation from a senior operations coordinator after a public incident. And the company's risk did not begin when I blocked Cassian in the garage. It began when Cassian decided his past investment gave him the right to follow her after she ended both the engagement and the conversation. Elowen watched her carefully, and for the first time that morning, the board was not looking at a scandal. They were looking at a CEO taking back the frame. The meeting did not end cleanly, because powerful rooms never surrender all at once. Elowen ordered legal to preserve all footage, restricted Cassian's access to company facilities, and suspended direct communication with board members pending formal review of investor conduct. It was not victory, not yet, but it was enough to stop his version from becoming the only one. When the room cleared, Seren stayed seated, staring at the dark screen where Cassian's face had been. I gathered the tablet and turned to leave, but her voice stopped me at the door. She said I should not have risked my career for her. The words were controlled, but beneath them I heard the same woman from the red light, the one who had reached for my hand, because trust had become more honest than fear. I looked back at her across the conference room, no longer willing to hide behind title, distance, or the clean excuse of duty. I didn't risk it for my boss, I said. I risked it because he was trying to rewrite what happened to you. Seren followed me out of the conference room before I made it halfway down the executive corridor, which told me two things at once. The board meeting had not finished with her emotionally, and my last sentence had landed harder than I intended. I heard her heels behind me, quick but controlled, the same rhythm she used when walking into client negotiations where everyone underestimated her and regretted it 10 minutes later. I stopped near the rooftop access stairwell because the operations floor had too many glass walls, too many listening desks, and too many people pretending not to watch the space between us. Seren closed the distance with a calm face and furious eyes. She said my name once, low enough that no one else would hear it, but sharp enough that I knew this was not a thank you. I opened the stairwell door and stepped inside. She followed without hesitation, and the door shut behind us with a heavy click that separated us from the company, the board, the rumors, and every professional excuse I had been using since the red light. The stairwell was quiet except for the dull hum of the building and the distant vibration of traffic through concrete. Seren stood 2 steps below me, which should have made her look smaller but somehow did not. She looked more dangerous there than she had in the boardroom, because the public version of her had been built for attack, but this version was built from truth. She asked what I meant when I said I had not risked my career for my boss. I told her she knew what I meant. That was a mistake. Seren Hawthorne had spent years with men turning meaning into fog so they could escape accountability. Her expression went cold, and she said if I had something to say to her, I could say it plainly or not say it at all. I respected that so much it almost made me smile at the worst possible time. So I said it plainly. I told her I had wanted her before last night, before Cassian followed us, before she reached for my hand, before the whole company had a reason to put our names in the same sentence. I had wanted her in quiet moments I had no right to keep. When she corrected a client without raising her voice, when she stood alone after meetings pretending she was checking emails because she needed 30 seconds to breathe, when she trusted my judgment in rooms where men with larger titles were still talking over her. Seren did not move, but the anger in her face shifted into something more unprotected. I kept going because stopping would have been cowardice disguised as restraint. I told her I had buried it under the job because the job was real and clean and easy to defend. She was the CEO. I was senior operations. She had investors, board politics, public expectations, and a former fiancé who would turn any personal choice into evidence against her. I had spent years becoming useful enough to be trusted and quiet enough not to threaten anyone's arrangement. Wanting her made all of that unstable. It made me visible in a way I had trained myself not to be. Seren listened with her arms folded, but her fingers pressed into her sleeves as if she needed somewhere to put the force of what she was hearing. When I finished, she asked if I thought she had never noticed me. The question was soft, and because of that, it hit harder than if she had shouted. She said she noticed me every day I thought I had disappeared into the background. She noticed that I never spoke just to prove I belonged in a room. She noticed that when other men praised her, they often wanted credit for recognizing her, but when I respected her, I did it by making sure the work behind her did not fail. She noticed that I did not flatter her when she was right and did not shrink from her when she was angry. She noticed that during high-pressure events, I gave instructions like a man who did not need to humiliate anyone to be obeyed. She noticed that I watched exits not because I wanted to run, but because I wanted everyone else to have a way out. Then her voice lowered, and she said the most dangerous thing about me was not that I had put Cassian against a pillar without losing control. The most dangerous thing was that when she was near me, she did not feel like she had to perform strength to be respected. She could be tired, furious, uncertain, even afraid, and I still looked at her like she had not become less powerful. I had no defense against that. Physical threats were simple compared to a woman seeing the exact place where you had hidden your hunger to be known. I told her she made me want things I had taught myself not to ask for. She asked what things. I looked through the narrow stairwell window toward the gray city beyond it, because looking directly at her made honesty feel less like speech and more like stepping off a ledge. I told her I wanted to stop being the man people trusted only in emergencies. I wanted to be chosen when the room was calm, when no one was chasing, when no crisis made my presence necessary. I wanted to stand beside her in daylight without wondering if everyone would call it weakness on her part or ambition on mine. I wanted her hand in mine without Cassian's headlights behind us, making the truth easier to excuse. Seren's eyes shone, but she did not look away. She said I kept speaking as if her choice would only be real once no one could question it. Then she stepped up one stair, bringing herself almost level with me, and said people like Cassian would question her choices no matter what she did. If she waited for a clean room, she would spend her whole life letting other people decide when she was allowed to want something. The distance between us changed. It was not sudden. It had been changing since the red light, maybe since the first time she trusted me with a decision that mattered. But in that stairwell, with the boardroom still cooling behind us and Cassian's version of the story finally losing ground, the tension stopped pretending to be only professional. Seren's hand lifted, not to grab me, not like she had at the intersection when fear and trust had moved before words, but with a deliberate calm that made it more dangerous. Her fingers touched the front of my shirt near the collar, light enough that I could have stepped back if I wanted. I did not. I looked at her mouth, then her eyes, and everything I had been using to hold the line suddenly felt less like honor and more like fear wearing a good suit. She said my name, not as a warning, not as a command, but as an invitation to stop making her prove she knew what she was doing. I leaned closer before I could build another argument against it. For one breath, there was no board, no company hierarchy, no Cassian waiting to weaponize whatever he could not own. There was only Seren, close enough that I could see the faint exhaustion under her perfect makeup, close enough to understand that the strength I admired in her had never meant she should be left alone with every wound. Her hand tightened once against my shirt, and I almost kissed her. Almost. Then the image of the boardroom returned with brutal clarity. Her name on the glass door, my title in the incident packet, Cassian's attorney turning every frame into implication, employees already whispering before breakfast. I stopped with barely an inch between us, and the hurt that crossed her face made me feel worse than if Cassian had put a fist into me. I told her I could not let our first kiss become evidence in someone else's story. The second I said it, I knew it was both true and not enough. Seren stepped back, her hand falling from my shirt. Her expression closed slowly, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too well and was tired of understanding everyone else's reasons before anyone trusted hers. I told her I wanted her, and that was exactly why I needed to make sure wanting her did not cost her more than Cassian already had. She looked at me for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough to hurt. She said sometimes a man could be so afraid of dishonoring a woman that he refused to believe she knew what she wanted. Then she opened the stairwell door and walked back into the office, leaving me alone with the truth that restraint could still wound when it asked a woman to wait outside her own choice. By noon, the company had split into three kinds of silence. The silence of people afraid to say Seren's name too loudly, the silence of people waiting to see which side would become safer, and the silence of people like Marin Shaw, who were too busy holding the building together to waste oxygen on gossip. I spent the next few hours in operations reviewing incident logs, rerouting staff assignments, and pretending my body was not still standing in that stairwell with Seren's hand on my shirt and her voice telling me I had mistaken restraint for respect. She was not wrong, and that made it harder to file away. I had stopped because I did not want our first kiss turned into evidence, but there was another truth under that one. I had also stopped because if Seren chose me clearly, without fear, without Cassian behind us, without the cover of crisis, then I would have to stand in the open and believe I was not just the man useful in emergencies. I would have to believe a woman like her could want me in daylight. The next crisis arrived wearing a navy suit and a reporter-friendly smile. Cassian appeared at the Meridian Tower walkthrough just after 3, even though his access to company facilities had been restricted that morning and his direct communication with the board was supposed to go through legal. The Meridian job was not a small contract. It was a major client security walkthrough for a high-profile private auction, the kind of account that could feed an entire quarter of revenue and make nervous board members suddenly rediscover their faith. Seren was leading the walkthrough herself because that was how she answered doubt. She stepped directly into the room that wanted to measure her and made the room feel underprepared. I was there with the site team, Marin beside the client liaison, 2 security leads near the freight elevator, and enough staff within sight that Cassian's arrival could not be mistaken for coincidence. He did not come alone. That was the first thing I noticed. A legal aide trailed him, carrying a slim folder. A public relations consultant I recognized from investor events hovered behind him with a phone already in hand. Cassian understood what the boardroom had cost him. Private pressure had failed. Footage had damaged the version he wanted to sell. So he had moved the fight into a client space, where Seren would have to choose between confronting him and looking unstable in front of money. He greeted the client liaison first, not Seren, which was deliberate. Then he smiled at the group and said he was only there to ensure continuity during a sensitive moment for the company. Seren's face went still in the way it did when she was turning anger into strategy. She told him he was not authorized to attend the walkthrough. Cassian looked almost sad when he answered, as if her professionalism disappointed him personally. He said several stakeholders had concerns about leadership continuity, and until the review was complete, he believed responsible parties should remain visible. Responsible parties. The phrase made my hands relax instead of tighten. That was something Talon had taught me years ago. When anger comes, do not grip. Grip makes you predictable. I moved 3 steps to my right, not close enough to challenge Cassian, but enough to put myself near the staff entrance he would need if he tried to draw Seren out of the client's view. Seren continued speaking to the Meridian team, explaining entry screening, auction floor camera coverage, and emergency guest movement with a level voice that made Cassian's interruption look smaller by the second. That should have been the end of it. A smarter man would have retreated and looked patient. But Cassian had confused control with intelligence for too long. He stepped closer during the elevator transition and said, just loudly enough for the right people to hear, that everyone understood why Seren might be overcorrecting after last night's emotional confusion. Then he looked at me and added that certain employees had clearly mistaken access for intimacy. The hallway changed around that sentence. Staff looked down. The client liaison froze with a polite smile dying on her face. Marin's eyes cut toward me like a warning and a plea at once. I felt the old instinct rise, the one that wanted to solve the threat by stepping in front of it completely. But Seren's words from the stairwell stopped me before my body could move too far. She did not need me to take her voice. She needed me to make sure no one took the space where her voice could stand. Cassian angled toward her, lowering his tone as if he was offering privacy, and tried to guide her away from the group with one hand hovering near her elbow. I stepped into that path, calm, square, and close enough that his hand had nowhere to land unless he wanted everyone to see him force the issue. I did not touch him. I only looked at Seren and waited. That was the difference, and she saw it. I was not asking permission to protect her like a possession. I was giving her the room to decide how the next second would go. Seren looked from my face to Cassian's hand, then back to the staff, the client, the legal aide, and every person pretending not to hold their breath. When she spoke, her voice did not shake. She said, "Mister," Rook was not part of the Meridian security walkthrough, had no operational authority over Hawthorne protective events, and had followed her from a company gala the night before after she refused further private discussion. She stated that he entered restricted company property without authorization, approached her vehicle after being told not to, and was stopped by senior operations only after he attempted to bypass a physical boundary. Every sentence was clean enough for a legal transcript and sharp enough to draw blood. Cassian's smile held for half of it, then began to fail. He tried to interrupt by saying she was proving his concern, that this kind of public accusation was exactly the instability investors feared. Seren turned toward the client liaison, not Cassian, and apologized for the interruption with the kind of controlled authority that made everyone remember whose company had been hired to manage risk. Then she looked back at him and said the company did not confuse a woman's refusal with instability, and neither would any client worth protecting. The PR consultant's phone lowered slightly. The legal aide glanced at Cassian like he had begun costing more than he was worth. Cassian saw the shift and made the mistake men like him make when charm stops working. He moved towards Seren too quickly. This time I blocked him with my body before he came within arm's reach of her. Not dramatic, not wild, not enough for him to turn into a performance, but absolute. He hit the stop of my presence the way a man hits a locked gate he assumed would open. I kept my voice low and told him to step back. He said I was finished. I told him he could discuss my employment with legal after security removed him from a restricted client area. Then I looked past him toward our two site leads. They had been waiting for my cue, and I gave it with one small nod. They moved immediately, professional and controlled, one on each side, creating a clean escort path toward the service elevator. Cassian's face flushed as he realized this would not look like a powerful man being challenged by a jealous employee. It would look like an unauthorized former investor being removed from a client site after ignoring the CEO's boundary. Before the elevator doors closed on him, Cassian looked at Seren and said she would regret choosing this. Seren stepped forward, not close enough to be unsafe, but close enough that everyone heard her answer. She said, "No, Cassian. I regret how long I let you call control concern." The doors closed, taking his anger with them, and for a few seconds the hallway remained so quiet I could hear the elevator cables move behind the wall. Then, the client liaison cleared her throat and asked Seren if they should continue the walkthrough from the auction floor entry plan. That was the moment the room chose her. Not emotionally, not personally, but professionally, where it mattered for the company Cassian had tried to weaken. Seren nodded, picked up exactly where she had left off, and led the group forward as if power had never left her hands. Only after the walkthrough ended and the client team departed did Seren turn toward me in the side corridor. Marin stood several feet away, pretending to review notes while absolutely listening. The site leads gave us space with the subtle loyalty of men who knew when their commander had earned a private minute. Seren looked at me for a long moment, and there was no CEO mask strong enough to hide what had passed between us in that hallway. She had seen me hold the line without taking the stage from her. I had seen her reclaim the story in front of everyone who mattered. Whatever had been forbidden before was still complicated, still risky, still surrounded by titles and consequences, but it was no longer invisible. She stepped closer and said quietly, "This is your last chance to hide behind my job title." I looked at her, at the woman Cassian had tried to corner, the leader the room had just followed, the person who had reached for my hand when fear could have made her smaller and instead made her honest. For the first time, I did not reach for the safest answer. I said, "Then I'm done hiding." Seren did not answer me in the side corridor after I said I was done hiding, and I was grateful for that because the sentence needed to stand on its own before either of us tried to turn it into something easier. Marin looked up from her tablet just long enough to understand that the shape of the room had changed. Then, with the mercy of a woman who knew every important thing before anyone confessed it, she announced that the client files needed urgent review in operations and took the site leads with her. When the corridor emptied, Seren and I remained facing each other under the clean white lights of Meridian Tower. Not touching, not yet, but closer to honesty than we had been even in the stairwell. She looked at me like she was trying to decide whether I had finally said what I meant or only found a stronger way to delay the truth. I could not blame her. I had used duty, timing, reputation, and respect as shields so many times that even my bravery probably sounded like another door closing softly. She asked what done hiding meant when the company still had policies, the board still had opinions, Cassian still had lawyers, and I still worked under her name. That was Seren. Even with her heart in the room, she did not stop seeing the whole board. I told her it meant I would not pretend my feelings were only professional caution, and I would not let Cassian's attempt to weaponize us become the reason I treated her like a scandal waiting to happen. It meant we would handle the job cleanly, document what needed to be documented, and make decisions in daylight instead of letting fear make them for us in hallways. She watched me carefully, and I stepped back just enough to prove I was not asking her to collapse the distance because I had finally found my courage. I told her if she needed me transferred out of direct reporting, I would request it. If legal required a disclosure, I would cooperate. If the board wanted to review the chain of command, I would sit through every cold question they had. But I would not call what I felt for her a misunderstanding just because Cassian had tried to poison the ground around it. For a moment, the only sound was the elevator somewhere behind the wall. Seren's face shifted, not into softness, but into something steadier. She said Cassian had spent years turning her choices into evidence against her. If she stayed with him, he called it loyalty. If she left, he called it instability. If she built the company, he called it the result of his belief. If she defended herself, he called it emotional overreaction. She was tired, she said, of men deciding what her choice meant before she even made it. Then she looked straight at me and asked if I saw her as a mistake that could cost me my job, or as a woman I was willing to choose when no one was chasing us. The question was calm, but it carried every red light, every phone call, every inch I had stopped short of kissing her in the stairwell. I wanted to answer fast, but fast answers had failed her before. So I took my time and gave her the truth without decoration. I told her I was not afraid of losing the job as much as I was afraid of becoming one more man who made her life harder and then called it love. That answer reached her. I saw it in the way her shoulders lowered by the smallest degree. She said the difference was that Cassian wanted to own the direction of her life, while I kept trying, sometimes badly, to protect her right to choose it. She said my restraint had hurt her because it made her feel doubted, but she understood the part of it that came from not wanting to turn her into gossip, proof, or conquest. Then she stepped closer, not enough to erase the professional world around us, but enough to make the personal one impossible to deny. She said she did not need a man to make her smaller so he could feel strong. She did not need a rescuer who mistook fear for permission. What she wanted was harder. A man who could stand beside her when rooms turned hostile, strong enough to act when action was needed, disciplined enough not to take control when the choice was hers, and honest enough not to hide behind respect when what he really felt was love. The word did not land like a confession yet. It landed like a door neither of us could pretend was not there. We handled the practical pieces first because that was what adults did when feelings had consequences. By the end of the week, legal had the footage, Cassian's access was formally revoked, and Elowen Price, who cared more about stability than romance, recommended a structural change that removed me from Seren's direct reporting line. It was not glamorous. It involved forms, policy review, and one meeting where a board member tried to sound delicate while asking whether our personal relationship would compromise executive judgment. Seren answered before I could. She said her judgment had been compromised for years only when people mistook Cassian's influence for stability, and she would not allow the company to confuse transparency with weakness. I requested a transfer into an independent security logistics division the company had been planning to launch, with my performance reviewed by operations oversight instead of the CEO's office. It was clean. It was documented. It gave no one the easy story Cassian had wanted, and more importantly, it gave Seren and me a way to step toward each other without asking secrecy to carry the weight. Cassian did not disappear overnight. Men like him rarely left a room the first time the door closed. He tried legal pressure, investor whispers, and one final carefully worded statement about wishing Seren clarity during a difficult personal season. But the footage had changed the temperature. The Meridian client stayed. 2 board members who had been privately accepting Cassian's calls suddenly preferred formal channels. Marin, with the serene brutality of an assistant who had archived every email since the beginning of time, produced a pattern of messages proving Cassian had blurred investor concern with personal access for months. The story did not become easy, but it became harder for him to own. Seren did not celebrate that publicly. She just walked into work each morning with a little less armor and a little more air around her, and every time I saw that, I understood that protection was not always a body between her and danger. Sometimes protection was evidence, patience, distance when needed, and the refusal to let someone else define what her strength had to look like. The first time I kissed her, there was no chase, no ringing phone, no SUV idling behind us, and no boardroom waiting on the other side of the wall. It happened in the company parking garage 2 weeks after Meridian, late enough that most of the building had emptied, under the same kind of cold fluorescent light that had once made the world look dangerous. Seren had come down from a client dinner in a dark green dress, tired but not cornered, holding her heels in one hand because she had decided elegance no longer required suffering after midnight. I was waiting beside my car, not because she needed a driver, but because she had asked me to meet her there. She stopped in front of me and said this was the first time since the gala that no one was chasing her. I said I knew. She said there were no headlights behind us, no phone calls, no Cassian, no excuse. I said I knew that too. Then she asked if I was still going to make her prove she knew what she wanted. I did not. I asked if I could kiss her, because choice had become the language we trusted most. Seren smiled then, small and real and nothing like the smile she gave donors, and said yes. When I kissed her beside my car, it did not feel like rebellion against Cassian or a reward for surviving a scandal. It felt quiet, earned, and stronger than all the dramatic moments that had pushed us there. Her hand rested against my chest, not gripping in fear this time, not reaching across a console at a red light, but choosing contact because she wanted it. I held her like a man who knew strength did not mean taking more than was offered. For years, I had thought being useful was the closest I would get to being wanted. Seren kissed me like she had seen every hidden part of that belief, and decided it was wrong. Months later, Hawthorne Protective Events looked different from the inside. Seren was still CEO, still sharp enough to make careless clients sit straighter, still elegant in rooms that expected her to apologize for power. But she laughed more often in the spaces between battles, and when someone called her difficult, she no longer treated it like an accusation that needed correction. I ran the new logistics division from 2 floors below, close enough to understand the rhythm of her world, separate enough that no one could pretend my career lived in her shadow. Cassian became a name in old legal threads and cautionary conversations, less a man than a reminder of what control sounded like when it dressed itself as love. Marin claimed she had known everything before we did and charged us both in coffee for the emotional inconvenience. The red light became ours, though neither of us admitted that out loud at first. One night after a late private auction, I drove Seren home through the same intersection where she had first reached for my hand. The city was wet again, the road shining with reflected brake lights, but this time there was no black SUV behind us, no phone flashing with a name that felt like a command. Seren sat beside me with her shoes off, one foot tucked under her, looking out at the city like it finally belonged to her without requiring a fight at every corner. When the light turned red, she reached across the console and placed her hand over mine. I looked at her, and she looked back with that calm, dangerous softness that still made me forget every efficient thought I had. "Still my choice?" she asked. I turned my hand under hers and held it properly, steady but never tight. "Always," I said. Seren smiled and leaned back as the light turned green. "That's why I chose you, and that was the truth I had not understood the first night. A powerful woman can reach for a man's hand without becoming weak. A strong man can protect a woman without turning her life into something he owns. Sometimes the rarest kind of love is not the one that storms into the room, takes over the fight, and calls itself heroic. Sometimes it is the one that watches the mirror, sees the danger, keeps the car steady, and says with every action, you still get to choose where you go. Do you think a powerful woman can still need someone's hand without losing her strength? And is the strongest kind of man the one who protects without controlling? Tell me what you think in the comments. If this story made you feel something, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.